Hey, what's going on, guys? So I was originally going to do a video reacting to the recent Temtem trailer and sort of give my thoughts and opinions on the new area that was revealed and sort of speculate on what its possible functions will be in the early access and post-launch. But I'm going to save that video for later because recently there's been a lot of talk of Temtem status conditions, and I do know that during my playthrough of the second stress test, I had little to no knowledge of some of the obscure status effects. So with all that being said, I figured I'd do what I do best and do some research on the topic. I'm going to start here on the Temtem wiki and sort of give a layman's overview of each one, but before we get into that, let's start with a general overview of status effects as a whole and what we can expect. Status conditions are passive effects that can be applied in combat to a Temtem through the use of technique or the activation of a trait. There are 14 different conditions, each with its own distinct effect. A Temtem can have up to 2 active status conditions at a time, and when a new status condition is applied, the oldest active one is removed. They are also non-volatile, which means that statuses can't be removed by swapping Temtem and remain even when you exit combat. Their duration is not fixed, but it changes depending on the technique that inflicted such status condition. So this is pretty straightforward overall, especially if you've played Pokemon. So status effects can be inflicted by moves or abilities. Nothing new here. What is interesting, however, is the fact that you can have up to 2 status effects at a time. Now, some status effects cancel each other out, which we will get into later, but for those effects that don't, you can have someone, let's say, poisoned and burned at the same time. If you try to apply a third status, the attack won't fail. It will instead swap in the newest status for the oldest one applied. If you've ever worked at a fast food restaurant, you've probably heard of the term FIFO, first in, first out, meaning that the first status condition applied will be the first one to leave if the Temtem is overwhelmed with 3 conditions. Status effects can't be double stacked for the most part. We will get into one nuance to this in a sec, but basically if you try to poison a Tem twice in a row, the attack will fail. One last thing to note is that there are 14 status effects as of right now, so it's definitely a little more complicated than the 8 or so present in Pokemon. So this infograph was uploaded to r/playtemtem by user LegionGaming, so credit where credit's due. I'm going to leave a link to it in the description below for a more simple breakdown of each status condition and what it does, but for now we will be using the wiki as it has a more elongated version where this picture was likely sourced from. I would definitely recommend downloading it as a source while playing if you can't remember what each of the status effects do. I more likely than not am going to create some sort of Temtem folder just to have on the side so I can insert all the infographics and whatnot if I need a convenient spot to find info. But anyway, so let's get into it. So remember that I said you usually can't stack the same status condition? Well, this is the sole antithesis to that. If cold is afflicted twice, the Temtem becomes frozen. Frozen Temtem cannot attack, but they can rest normally. Cold and frozen also serve to erase the burnt condition from a Temtem, while burnt erases both cold and frozen. So let's start with cold. Cold basically does nothing by itself. Think of it as like building up a curse or frozen or poison meter in Dark Souls. The meter itself does nothing, but once that meter is full, you get the status associated with it. Cold is much the same. Stacking cold once would fill theoretically 50% of this meter, and twice would fill it, causing the frozen status. It's actually quite the interesting concept considering frozen seems to be, like it kind of sucks to be the frozen one. When you're frozen, you can't attack. You can only rest to recover stamina. If you do, however, get burnt, the frozen or cold status will disappear. So this is an example of 2 statuses that can't be stacked together. A sleep Temtem cannot attack, but if they are damaged, they'll wake up, aka the condition is removed. Any damage that is done to the Temtem will remove the asleep condition. Mental type Temtem are immune to this condition. So this is pretty much the same as you'd expect in Pokemon. However, if you do damage the Temtem, it'll wake up. So from a surface level, it seems kind of counterproductive, but I could see it being used to incapacitate one Tem while focusing another. The only way the other player can sort of force that Tem awake is to have their own Tem damage it, which, unless it's a multi-targeting attack, it'll completely waste the other Tem's turn, essentially incapacitating both. Also, as we said, mental types aren't affected by this status. Trapped Temtem cannot swap out. There's not really much to say, it's pretty straightforward. Essentially, it's the same as Mean Look in Pokemon. Once the turn counter on the doomed Temtem hits 0, the Temtem faints. This is also relatively simple. The status condition is very similar to that of Perish Song. Your Temtem will receive a counter. Once that hits 0, goodbye. Seized Temtem will lose their Gear's effects. This is actually quite interesting. It reminds me of Knockoff, but in status form. Basically, your held items don't work when you're afflicted. Poison Temtem lose 1/8 of their health every turn. Temtem of the toxic type are immune to this condition. So again, this one is similar to Pokemon, but it's a little different. So in Pokemon, a poison target will lose 1/16 or 1/16, and then it'll stack up by 1/16 if it's badly poisoned. Whereas in this, the Temtem lose 1/8. Burnt Temtem lose 1/16 of health every turn, and it reduces both attack and special attack by 30%. Temtem of the fire type are immune against this condition. The burnt condition erases cold and frozen when applied to a Temtem, while both can similarly erase the burnt condition from a Temtem. So this one's also similar to Pokemon, but instead of cutting the attack stat by 50%, it cuts both attack and special attack by 30%. As mentioned earlier, it's counteracted by the cold and frozen conditions. The stamina costs of an exhausted Temtem increase by 50%. This condition was actually something that my Howchick would inflict on enemies during my stress test run, and being as I was, rushing to get as far as I could, I didn't really take the time to figure out exactly what it was doing to them. So basically the description says it all. Pretty cool effect if you ask me. So basically this is the opposite of exhausted, although it has no mention whether or not it's canceled by exhausted or if exhausted cancels it. So I'm curious, if you have both statuses at the same time, what happens? I know that mathematically they would cancel each other out, like plus 50, minus 50, but I'm curious if you can actually hold both of them. Immune Temtem are unable to be subject to new status conditions. Very simple, and also seems to be very useful. I can see tons of use for this. Each turn, the regenerated Temtem heals for 1/10 of its health. So this is like a more powerful leftovers, healing 1/10 instead of 1/16. There's not really much else to say. Neutralized Temtem have their resistance and weaknesses omitted. So at first I was going to say this seems to be something that transforms Temps to neutral type, but that's not the case because neutral is weak to mental, and this status deletes all weaknesses and strengths. I couldn't find any info on as to whether or not it affects the same type attack bonus, so if anyone knows, please let me know in the comments below. Synergies do not work with the exiled Temtem. It's a pretty simple concept. The synergy effect doesn't work when afflicted. Makes sense. As of right now, no Tem has access to it, but likely will further down the line. So yeah, that's sort of a brief overview of all 14 status conditions and how they will affect your Temtem moving forward. Let me know what you guys think. Any statuses stand out as more useful than others? Any statuses that you think might get overlooked in the competitive scene? I'm curious to know what your guys' thoughts are on the matter. Also, make sure to remember that we have 3 more days until the early access launch of Temtem, and with all that being said, make sure to like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at GymLeaderEd, and until next time, peace.